Hey folks, this is a video from section 8.6. You're going to be learning how to graph the parent sine function, So if you've printed off your notes, which I would strongly recommend since it automatically gives you graph paper, if you've printed out your notes, you'll notice that I have both an XY axis and I also have an XY chart. So let's take a look at what we're going to be graphing. I want to graph here the function y is equal to sine of x, where I'm going to be placing x values, these are going to be my angles, into the function, and then I'm going to be graphing the y value. So I will have an x and a y coordinate that I can graph. One thing to note here is that I did make a mistake on my XY chart. So if you'll go down to the bottom of the first column, you'll notice that I have a 2 pi right here. That should not be 2 pi, that should be just a single pi. So go ahead and get rid of that 2 there to make that correct. Notice that what I've done is for my x's, I've just made a list around the unit circle of my radian angles. So this is the exact same thing as the unit circle all the way around. As we're going through this, what I'd like for you to have out is your unit circle. And since we're graphing the sine, remember that around the unit circle, my sine values are my y values. So for this particular parent graph, we're only going to be paying attention to the y values of each coordinate around the unit circle. So let's go. If my radian value is 0, if I'm at my 0 radian or the same place as 0 degrees, what is the sine value there? What is the y value there? Well, it's 0. Now go on up to pi over 6. What is the y value or the sine value at pi over 6? It's a short leg, so it's 1/2. What is the y value at pi over 4? This is root 2 over 2. The y value at pi over 3 is root 3 over 2. The y value up at the top, at the end of the first quadrant there, at pi over 2, is going to be 1. Now let's go into the second quadrant. The y value at 2 pi over 3 is root 3 over 2. It's a long leg. Y value at 3 pi over 4, root 2 over 2. Y value at 5 pi over 6, 1/2. And the y value at pi, 0. So that takes care of quadrants 1 and 2. Let's go back up to the top. Let's look at the y value for 7 pi over 6. Now we're going down, so this is going to be a negative 1/2. Y value at 5 pi over 4, negative root 2 over 2. Y value at 4 pi over 3 is negative root 3 over 2. Y value down at the bottom, negative 1. Into the fourth quadrant, y value at 5 pi over 3, long leg, root 3 over 2, but it's negative. 7 pi over 4 is negative root 2 over 2. Y value at 11 pi over 6 is a short leg, negative 1/2. And then we're back to the beginning. The y value at 2 pi is 0. So now what I have here is literally a list of coordinates, a list of xy values that we're going to go to our graph, and we're going to graph all of these on the xy plane, on the xy axis. Now, I have marked out for you the middle of each quadrant and the end of each quadrant. So you'll notice right here, this is my first quadrant, and then I go into my second quadrant here, my third quadrant here, and then my fourth quadrant here. I can fill in other values, but what I want you to notice, let me zoom in here to show you just the first quadrant. Remember that in our unit circle, the first quadrant has 3 values inside of it. So we've got our pi over 6, our pi over 4, our pi over 3, and it ends with pi over 2. I'm not going to go and fill in all of these, but notice every single one of these quadrants has a group of 3, and then my single one, which is at the axis. Again, a group of 3, and my single one at the axis. So it does go around my unit circle just as normal. I've also marked on the the y-axis, I've marked 10 blocks. If you'll look at all of your y values, Your biggest value is 1, so I'm going to make 1 up 10 blocks and -1 down 10 blocks. And in order to do some graphing, I need some decimal values. Of course, we know that 1/2 is equal to 0.5. Root 2 over 2 is the same thing as 0.7071. Root 3 over 2 is 0.8660. And that's all of the decimals we'll have. They're just going to be positives and negs after that. So now we're ready to graph. Our very first coordinate that we're graphing is 0, 0, so of course that's on the origin. At pi over 6, we're going to graph a half. Well, since 1 is 10 blocks, a half is going to be up 5 blocks. Pi over 4 is going to be graphed at 0.7, so I'm going to go up 7 blocks for that. Pi over 3 is up about 8.5 blocks. And then pi over 2 is all the way up 10 blocks, all the way up at 1. Then we come back down into the second quadrant. So at 2 pi over 3, we're at 8.5 blocks. 3 pi over 4, 7 blocks. 5 pi over 6, 5 blocks. And at pi, we're back to 0. Then we go into the third quadrant. Now we're going down this time. So at 7 pi over 6, we're down 5 blocks. At 5 pi over 4, down 7 blocks. At 4 pi over 3, 8.5 blocks. And then at 3 pi over 2, all the way down at 1, which is 10 blocks. And then into the fourth quadrant. So at 5 pi over 3, we have 8.5 blocks. At 7 pi over 4, 7 blocks. At 11 pi over 6, 5 blocks. And then 2 pi, we're back to the beginning, back to the x-axis. Now you can kind of see a wave here, and it's not a mountain. These are not sharp peaks. This is a very nice curvy graph. Sorry about that. A little wavery here. And this is the sine parent. Stay tuned for the cosine parent.